Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. Now, the period of history known as the Viking Age has many misconceptions, half-truths, inaccuracies, and sometimes even deliberate distortion of the truth in the popular mind, so that when it comes to the Norse people of Scandinavia, usually referred to in itself, often quite incorrectly, as the Vikings, the knowledge often wavers considerably from genuine fact into semi-fantasy, in some cases more akin to a comic book than anything to do with genuine history or mythology. Allegedly historical dramas on television perpetrate many of these misconceptions and inaccurate half-truths. And the woeful Thor movies. Oh, the Thor movies. Don't get me going on that. They turn the image of the Viking Age into something more akin to Star Trek than to anything from Scandinavia, with Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, resembling a futuristic airport runway with flashing lights on it. Take note, Marvel movies. Rainbows are curved, not flat, and they glow. They don't flash. No. And this is not the produce only of Mr. and Mrs. Average Citizen, the man in the street, as the saying goes. Well, these days we should really say the man and woman in the street. No, I've seen supposedly well-researched historical documentaries on television or on YouTube that sometimes get the facts wrong, or perpetrate a common misconception rather than dispelling it. And this applies not just to historical figures or events from the Viking Age itself, but to mythology as well, reaching all the way up to the home of the gods itself, Asgard, or Asgard, as it is in English. No, not Valhalla. That is not the home of the Norse gods. In fact, it doesn't even exist. There is no such place as Valhalla. Now, there's a misconception to begin with. There is, however, a place called Valhalla, which translates as the Hall of the Warriors Slain in Battle, from Val, meaning specifically one who dies in battle, and Hall, meaning a hall. And it's the great hall in Asgard where Odin entertains those who have fallen on the battlefield. The warriors feasting and drinking, fighting, and enjoying women until the end of the world, Ragnarok, shall come along. But you ask just about anyone, where do the Norse gods live? And they will say, well, Valhalla, which of course in its true form of Valhalla is simply one of many buildings in the genuine home of the gods, Asgard. And if you want an English version, that should be Valhalla, no A tacked onto it. There's another common error, actually, a final A added to the names of Norse goddesses. Idun becoming Iduna, Frigg called Frigga, and Hel being Hela. All quite incorrect. I do find it a bit annoying when people who know better still use Valhalla, for example. I've heard even experts say that if they want to use an English form rather than saying Valhalla, well, that's fine, but then why not remain more correct and just say Valhalla, as is the German form instead? That's just my opinion. Another common misconception about Norse religion is that all the gods had precise, specifically designated roles and duties, job descriptions, if you like, as do many of the gods of Olympus or ancient Egypt, of course. That there was a god of this or a goddess of that, such as the Greek Bacchus was god of wine, or Ares was a god of war. Demeter controlled the harvest, and along with her daughter Persephone, also the seasons, so that when Persephone, for example, went to Hades each year, winter came, because without her there could be no summer, because she and her mother, they were the summer, and so on. No, the Norse pantheon did not have specific tasks allotted to the gods. And while they may have been associated with something or other, that does not mean they were the official god of it. But it could only happen if they allowed it or they caused it to happen. Freya, for example, enjoyed hearing love songs. She had lovers. She used her favours in bed to obtain her famous necklace when the dwarves refused any other payment. And Odin said that she was very receptive of requests from men, which seems obvious, and that lovers should call on her. Thus, she is seen as the goddess of love. But though she was frequently involved with love in various aspects, and would, as Odin says, have looked favourably on those who were in love and given them some assistance where it needed, she was not the goddess of love. She had no specific designated responsibility for it, she wasn't in charge of it, and it happened between people without any direct assistance from her. She could have gone off somewhere like Persephone did for a few months, popped down to hell maybe for a chat, and people would still have been falling in love, having sex and making babies just the same. Nothing would have changed in her absence. Thor, no, he was a protector, a guardian if you like, but he wasn't in charge of thunder and lightning and the weather in general. It wasn't his job to decide if the day was going to be sunny or cloudy or if rain would fall. And nowhere in the sagas or old poems is he mentioned in any way connected with thunder and lightning. Tyr is often regarded as a god of war, but while he may have lost a hand fighting the giant wolf Fenrir, he wasn't a god devoted to war, as was the Greek Ares. Actually, if any Norse god was to be regarded as a god of war, it would have to be Odin, I should think, since it was he who often provoked conflict and decided who would live and who would die, sending the Valkyrie, or the Valkyries in English, to make sure those wishes were carried out. And Loki, well, Loki didn't have anything whatsoever to do with fire. He was a trickster, but he wasn't some sort of spirit of flame. In Loki's case, that may have originated with Richard Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelungs, in which he is depicted as a god of fire, with Odin, or Wotan, as he is in the German version, calling on him to surround the sleeping Brunhilde with a ring of magic fire. As I found thee of old, a wandering flame, he says. That may also, of course, have been helped by the word Logi, meaning a flame, being similar to the name Loki, but actually having no connection with him whatsoever. In his true Norse form, Loki couldn't have started a fire in his hearth without something to light it with. He'd have needed a flint and some kindling and twigs. Nor, of course, were Thor and Loki brothers, by the way. No, that's a misconception. That's pure Marvel comics. Hel was not the goddess of death, though she's frequently referred to as such, but rather she was goddess of the dead, which is not quite the same thing. There's death in both, but they're different. She did not cause death. She had no control over it. She had no say in how or where or when anyone died. She never killed anyone herself. She was simply charged by Odin to take care of the spirits of people who had died, looking after them in the realm that bore her name, Hel. That was all. Nor, indeed, was there a place called Helheim. The realm of the dead and its ruler bore the same name, as I said, Hel, spelled with one L, and it lay in Niflheim, the realm of mists. Helheim was a much later invention. It was a term that came up later on. It had nothing to do really with Old Norse mythology. Now Idun, yes, Idun could be seen as a goddess of youth, since it was her magic youth-giving apples that kept the gods young, but she wasn't that to mortals, since she didn't share her apples with the human population. Only the gods got to take a bite of those. So her responsibility towards youth stopped at the gates of Asgard. So the concept of every deity of Asgard being a god or goddess of something, being in charge of it and controlling it as part of their job description, is not correct. Though there were those who interfered in human affairs more than others, but they had no direct responsibility to do so. It wasn't their job. Staying up in Asgard. Another inaccuracy concerns the Valkyrie, plural, or Valkyria being the singular form, who I've already mentioned. The romantic warrior women who gather slain warriors from the battlefield and carry them aloft to feast with the gods in Asgard. They're always seen in that role, flying through the sky with dead warriors slung across their horses. And indeed their very name comes from that. Val, meaning, as I've said, one who is killed in battle, and Kyria, meaning someone feminine who chooses. So they are literally the choosers of the slain warriors. However, they had another duty, which was their principal duty, in fact. And that was not to carry dead men skywards. Oh no. It was to be their waitresses when they got there. The serving girls of Valhalla, the bar staff, if you like, bringing mead, ale, and meat to the once fighters, as the dead warriors were known, and probably providing, more intimate services as well. But even in the Viking Age, battles were really quite infrequent. Days or weeks or even months could pass without, anyone being killed anywhere. But in Valhalla, the drinking, the feasting, the fighting, and the other things, that went on 24/7, 365 days a year. You don't really need a lot of sleep when you're dead. The feasting going on all night, every night. So the Valkyries would have spent most of their time in their serving, rather than their dead men collecting roll. Now, that's something I've never seen mentioned by anyone else, but it's kind of obvious when you think about it. Now, it's not as romantic, of course, to be serving some mead to someone as dragging a dead warrior onto your horse and leaping into the sky, perhaps screaming something like Brynhilde's Hi-O-to-Ho battle cry from Wagner's Die Walküre, as the Ride of the Valkyries plays at full volume in the background. Da, 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 you know. But yeah, it's better than just sitting around for days on end playing board games while waiting for somebody to get killed somewhere so you can go and pick them up. Anyway, and with further regards to the Valkyries, we're not done with them just yet, it's frequently stated that they were Odin's daughters. The impression being that blood relation to the All-Father was a prime requirement for a Valkyrie. Well, that's a considerable piece of misinformation, I'm afraid. Nepotism had no place in Asgard. And no, they were not Odin's daughters. They were not even of all one species, being both human and divine. One named Sigrun, the daughter of a human king, and another the daughter of a female giant, for example, but all appointed to the position of Valkyrie by Odin. There is no indication in the sagas, even if the Valkyries had immortality or any other special attributes from their position other than the obvious ability to fly, and what seems to have been an invisibility of some kind, since they are seldom ever seen by the combatants on the battlefield, other than the dead ones, of course. Yet another misconception about them is that they only took those killed in battle aloft to Asgard. They didn't actually kill anyone themselves. They were not responsible for anyone's death. That's not true. One of their duties was to select who would die and who would live, following orders given to them by Odin before they left Asgard for the battlefield, making sure that those chosen by the All-Father to die did so, then taking them to Asgard after ensuring they were dead. The famous Valkyrie Bullying is punished by Odin for killing the wrong man in a battle. The man she was supposed to help, but he ended up dead, much to the annoyance of Odin. So they were actually far more complicated than is generally thought. Killers as well as gatherers of the dead. And of course waitresses and bar staff as well as, well, you know, being friendly, shall we say. Another frequent misconception is that the gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, were a completely different race from the Jotnar, or giants. Jotun being the singular form. And that the giants were, well, just that, giant, as in very big. Now, there were different types of giant, but most of them were a little different to anyone else. They weren't bigger. They weren't enormous in size, and the word Jotun has nothing to do with size, in fact. It comes from a root that means to eat, to consume. So the giants are really called big eaters, if you like. And they actually intermarried with the gods. Thor's mother, for example, was a giant, as was Odin's. Some of the gods themselves, indeed, were giants. Skadi, for example. And Tyr was the son of giant parents, which, well, that would make him a giant as well. They would be better seen as a different tribe, if you like, rather than a different race. Think of them, say, as the Apache and the Sioux, two tribes, rather than as Europeans and Africans, two races. I think that's the best way to look at the giants and the gods. Now, I think most people have got the message that Vikings did not wear horned helmets, though one still sees them depicted that way, even in places where they really should do a better service to historical truth, such as some museums that have Viking-themed items like keychains or little doll-like figures in their gift shops. Horns may well have been used by the Volva, the Nordic female shamans, since horn headdresses using deer antlers, for example, were and still are used by shamans. Maria Franz in the excellent German folk group Heilung uses a headdress, for example, with deer horns on it, looking very much as many a Volva would have looked. And some warriors would have decorated their helmets with symbols such as bones, feathers, horsehair, plumes, and the like. But a Viking war helmet with horns sticking out of it, actually an integral part of the helmet, is an invention of very recent times, which we may, well, lay once again principally at the feet of Wagner, or probably more correctly costume designers for his operas. The men in his operas were dressed with horns on their helmets, the women got wings. And illustrators of popular magazines and the like began drawing not only Wagner's characters in that manner, but genuine historical figures as well. So we got the Viking horned or winged helmet. It became the very symbol of the Vikings. Nothing else was needed to show who they were supposed to be. There's someone with a horned helmet. He's a Viking. Now, a real Viking would have worn something like this. This would have been a very, very typical helmet of those times with the nose guard. Or another very common helmet, the ocular type, so-called from the two eye protectors. But this would have been the sort of thing that your Viking would have turned up in, or perhaps just wearing a leather cap, or even nothing at all. Not everyone had a helmet. Calling them Vikings is in itself a misconception, since they weren't. No, the Vikings were not Vikings. Sorry about that. You see, despite being always referred to as Vikings, the Vikings weren't actually Vikings. Nobody in those days called them Vikings. Even the Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings. Because to call someone a Viking as a term of nationality, well, it'd be rather like calling a truck driver a truck. You know, he just drives a truck. He isn't actually a truck. Viking, or Vikinger in Old Norse, was a term that meant one who got in a ship, went somewhere in the ship, and did something or other when they got wherever it was that the ship got them to, be it raiding, trading, founding settlements, exploring, or just being a pirate. So they could go Viking, but they couldn't be Viking. They would not have called themselves Vikings. They would have called themselves Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes, as would other people. The anglo-saxons also calling them things like Northmen, heathens, Norsemen, plus I'm sure a lot of very obscene terms when they burned down somebody's village. And the Irish often referred to them as the dark foreigners, Danes, or the fair foreigners, Norwegians. Nobody called them Vikings. They didn't even use the term themselves, save in that very limited ship-related context. And even the ship wasn't actually a Viking ship. It was simply a long ship in which some men were sailing who were going Viking. The ship was, well, it was a ship. Get in a ship and sail off looking for plunder or adventure, trade, or new lands to settle, and you were a Viking. Stay at home, never set foot in a ship, you were a Dane, a Norwegian, or a Swede. You were Norse, as you were when you returned from your sea voyage and set foot on dry land once again. You left your Vikingness back in the ship. You know, if you would run into a village in 9th century England and said, "The Vikings are coming! Run!" everybody would have said, who are the Vikings? Just some sort of traveling, sideshow, jugglers, fire eaters? But had you run in and said, "The Northmen are coming! The Norse are here!" well, the villagers would have scattered like cockroaches when you turned the light on. Now, of course, the term Viking is attached to anything and everything to do with the Norse people. Viking this and Viking that, be it art, culture, weapons, religion, everything is Viking. But there was no Viking art or Viking clothing. There was plenty of Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish art and clothing. But I suppose, given its universal usage, we are stuck with the term Viking, like it or not, to describe everything and anything connected with Scandinavia 1,000 years ago. The Vikings, in the actual context of that term, are seen as the epitome of violence. Murdering, raping, and plundering with a savage ferocity never equaled before or since, taking wanton cruelty to positive Olympian heights of achievement, looting the hard work of others rather than working for anything themselves, and devoid of any basic human decency. Ah, the villains! Now, another misconception, I'm afraid, despite its being repeated in many documentaries and books. Documentaries that stress nothing but the brutality that obviously would accompany raiding, without any other aspects being considered, or the brutality itself analysed. All they focus on is the brutality, the cruelty, etc. of raiding. In truth, the Vikings were no more brutal than anyone else of their day, certainly no worse than the Roman legions of previous centuries, whose usual method of attack was to kill everything living, human or animal, that was in front of them until an officer told them to stop. Nor many of the noble Christian knights who followed them, slaughtering anyone and everyone in the name of God, the Spanish Inquisition, or indeed the ethnic cleansing of our own recent history. Yes, the Vikings killed ruthlessly when they attacked, just as everyone else did at that time, and they used brutality to good effect, making themselves feared so that people were less inclined to resist. The appearance of their fearsome-looking dragon ships alone enough to send terrified villagers running for the hills. One brutal massacre reported to other towns or villages made subsequent raids that much easier. People probably wouldn't resist. They'd just run away. And probably that actually saved lives on both sides in many instances. Not, of course, that would have been any great comfort to those who'd already died. That was good psychology. And it often resulted in people not even trying to fight them, but paying them to go away, as happened in England, for example, with the Danegeld, gaining them victory without loss to themselves. As well, of course, as bringing them back time and time again to get it, rather than what the English had intended it to do, which was to get rid of them altogether, making the Danegeld one of history's worst ideas. And of course, the Norse were frequently quite happy to trade. again gaining what they wanted without fighting for it. In fact, Norse trading became very extensive across the known world of that era, as we shall see. They are seen incorrectly as nothing but raiders. That's all they did, 365 days a year. Their considerable trading activities are usually overlooked, which is a great distortion of history, since they were the greatest traders of their day, travelling the river systems of Europe from the Baltic down to the Black Sea, reaching Constantinople and Baghdad, trading furs, superbly crafted metalwork, amber, timber, and slaves, returning with exotic goods from the Middle East as far as India. Their exploring and colonizing activities were extensive, greater than anyone else since the Roman Empire or those who came after them for many centuries, though even the Romans never got further west than Wales. Yet the Norse, well, they travelled to and settled in Ireland, the Orkney, Shetland and Faroe Islands, the Isle of Man, parts of Wales and Scotland, and far out across the Atlantic Ocean, to Iceland, Greenland, and to North America, to what we now know as Newfoundland and New Brunswick. They established settlements in France and England that would later, and what would later become Russia, leaving a considerable cultural legacy in the lands they settled in that has come down to us today. Most of the major towns here in Ireland, where I live, were founded by the Norse, not the native Irish. And both English and Irish Gaelic have many words in everyday use today that come from Old Norse, as well as town names. And the Vikings were very open to those people they settled among. Intermarriage and religious conversion became common, as in Ireland, for example. The Norse not viewing other races in the inferior and oppressive way the colonial empires of the 18th and 19th century did, when intermarriage with natives, well, damn it, old chap, that was unthinkable. They're hardly better than animals. They're only fit to be slaves for the benefit of the Europeans. You can't marry them. In that sense, the Norse were far more liberal and tolerant than the supposedly more civilized nations who would later colonize the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, whose treatment of many native populations exceeded anything the Vikings had done in its brutality. Indigenous people often becoming little more than slaves in their own lands, any resistance savagely put down. And unlike the Norse colonists, things like fair trade rather than exploitation, intermarriage, or conversion to the religion of those peoples, the way the Norse did to Christianity, that was out of the question. They were the greatest explorers, traders, merchants, settlers, and seafarers of their age. Indeed, the greatest till the so-called Age of Discovery, centuries later. And of course, they were excellent craftsmen, woodworkers, jewelers, as well as superb shipbuilders. The longship being perhaps the finest ship ever designed for its intended purpose. Indeed, it is entirely due to the longship that we have ever heard of the Vikings, since without it, there would have been no Vikings to hear of. They were the product of their amazing ships, and without those ships, they would never have ventured beyond Scandinavia. And the Vikings, in the sense that we use that word now, would never have existed. Now, they had raided prior to the Viking Age in what is termed the Vendel era, but those raids were not all that extensive, and they occurred to the east, raids into nearby and easily accessible lands around the Baltic that you didn't need ships really to go to. But it was the coming of the wonderful longship that sent the raiders and the traders to the west, to the south, into the Mediterranean Sea and beyond across the Atlantic. The new shipbuilding technology itself producing the Vikings. They were the produce of their ships. Now, the shield maidens, or Scoutmere, are another misconception, at least in the way they are depicted in the TV series Vikings. Regiments of them all carrying the same shield, marching off to war, banging drums and waving banners, off we go. No, the term shield maiden is actually hardly ever mentioned in the sagas, though there are a number of mentions of women taking up arms and fighting, usually in time of some great need, their relatives in danger, or some other family issue, such as when Gudrun picks up a sword and joins her brothers Hogni and Gunnar in battle, when Skadi's father is killed and she puts on armour and carries weapons to seek vengeance, or when Osrog dons armour and leads an army against Sweden. But did shield maidens actually exist in the real world as well as in the sagas? Well, there were female warriors in the army of the Rus, to be sure, those Vikings who settled in what is now Russia and Belarus, hence the names Russia and Belarus. We know that from the historical record. And there is a very interesting quote from the famous historian Saxo Grammaticus, or Saxo the Learned, in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, which was written circa 1200 AD, in which he states, "There were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men, and spent almost every minute cultivating soldier skills. They courted military expertise so earnestly that anyone would have guessed that they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities, who were tall and elegant, tended to embark on this way of life. They put toughness before allure, aimed at conflict rather than kisses, and desired not to be couch, but the kill. And those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lances. So the answer to the question must be yes, they did, under certain circumstances. But women as genuine warriors, now that is one whose training was to fight, if you like, would have been rare. Though women fighting as warriors, if the need arose, would not have been uncommon. Women fighting as individuals or small groups in certain circumstances, such if a village was attacked while most of the men were away, or the men were being hard-pressed, and women would have grabbed weapons and joined in, as would have been the case in other lands as well in ancient times. In Gaul, Britain, or Celtic Ireland, the same thing would have happened. But quite apart from the actual historical evidence I've just referred to, women mentioned in the sagas as fighting, joining in a battle when the need arose, show that the concept of women doing so was accepted, since other characters never seemed surprised by it or tried to stop them. The aspect of concept, the fact that if something was impossible, never happened, couldn't happen, they wouldn't mention it so often, is frequently overlooked. Now, yes, I know mythological subjects might well be pure fiction in the sagas, but not everyday matters of normal life. Things treated as being quite acceptable. In the case of Ragnar Lothbrok's wife, Oslo, for example, her sons make no attempt to stop her. They take part of the army by sea while she brings the rest by land. They don't say, "Oh, go home, mother, it's embarrassing having a woman leading our men." No. So the regiments of shield maidens marching off to war in the Vikings TV show is highly unlikely ever to have occurred, save for those ones of the Rus, or the ones mentioned by Saxo. But Norse women as individuals would have been present in combat as occasion required. And while on this subject, I'll deal with another misconception also created by the Vikings television show. Please sit down, this may come as a shock. Ragnar Lothbrok was never married to Lagertha. Oh, I know, I'm sorry to spoil much of the romantic aspect of the show, but his first wife was Thora, and then he married Oslo. Nor was actually Ragnar a real person as far as we can establish, so seemingly, he wouldn't really have been able to marry anyone since he didn't exist. He was apparently a composite figure made up from several genuine men who existed over a considerable number of years. Some of those said to have been his sons were real enough. They are historic figures. Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, Halfdan, and Bjorn Ironside were genuine historic figures. But their parental claims were probably, they were simply cashing in on a legend of their own time. Though they may well have been actual brothers and even had the name Ragnarsson, thus helping their fictitious claim to a relationship that could not actually have existed. Another very common misconception is the Vikings' supposed all-embracing hatred of Christianity. Of course, some Norse pagans would have disliked it, just as members of every faith have disliked other faiths all through history. And Christian attitudes to them, especially trying to convert them or kill them as evil pagans, didn't help in that regard. But that the Vikings had some unique, special detestation of Christians simply for being Christians as such isn't true. Their considerable intermarriage with the Christian Irish, and the numbers who converted to the new faith in Ireland and other countries they settled in as a result, is clear enough evidence of that. And of course, pagans as a group never set out to convert other people. They didn't send missionaries off to try to convince people to follow their gods. They did not try to convert others, nor did they burn people at the stake for not believing in their gods, as the Christian church did. I saw it very well put by someone who said that the Norse were generally very tolerant of other people's gods. They would even convert to them. But if you tried to make them worship those gods, you'd find an axe 5 inches inside your head. Well put. But I hear you ask, didn't the Vikings raid churches and monasteries, destroy nunneries, make a beeline for Christian religious sites, burn them? Well, yes, they did. Just as a burglar today raids wealthy houses in rich districts, where the most valuable things are to be found, rather than poverty-stricken ones in rundown slums with nothing worth taking. Most of the wealth in those days, of course, was in the hands of the church. Many bishops were frequently better off than the kings they served. Churches and monasteries were filled with gold and silver, precious jewels, offerings of money from the faithful to buy a better seat in heaven. So that is where the Viking raiders would go. Had the wealth of the day been in the hands of, say, the Muslims or the Jews, The Vikings would have ignored Christian establishments. They'd have walked past them. They'd have attacked mosques and synagogues. And of course today, we would be told, with equal misconception, that they hated Islam, they hated Judaism, and they wanted to wipe them from the face of the earth. Part of the Viking bad image, of course, with Christianity stems from the fact that early accounts of them were written mostly by monks and priests. Usually, of course, the only people able to read and write in those days, as well as being among their most frequent targets. So naturally, they tended to highlight the brutality of the Vikings, who were, of course, pagans anyway, and thus, in the eyes of the church, servants of Satan to begin with, who were totally vile and evil as a result, and, well, incapable of doing anything other than pure badness simply for their enjoyment of being bad. Nor, of course, were those townspeople who had their homes burned, their women taken as captives, and everything of value stolen very likely to have much interest in the culture of the people who'd done it. They wouldn't really have cared if the Norse sniffed flowers and wrote love poetry and cuddled kittens. Dead bodies and burned buildings were the only things they saw or cared about. That's understandable, of course, but it led to a distorted and misinformed view of the Norse people that has lingered down to the present day, since so many early accounts of them come from those who suffered most at their hands. Continuing with the misconceptions about them, the Norse are frequently seen as scruffy, unkept barbarians who probably smell very bad on a hot day, with matted, greasy hair and primitive personal habits. Their culture a backward and unenlightened one, well suited to the so-called Dark Ages. Again, that's a misconception. The Norse were probably the cleanest people of Europe in the early Middle Ages, combing their hair and washing their hands and faces every day, changing their clothes, and bathing once a week. The day that we know as Saturday today being Lagertha, which means the pool or the bath day. A weekly bath? A weekly bath, an unheard of thing among other peoples of that time who might bathe once a year, or well, maybe twice if they were a real clean freak. Norse cleanliness astonished the Anglo-Saxons, who were mystified by such strange and unnatural things. Why did they need more than the annual bath? And all that bothersome changing clothes, and the one you had on since last year, they were still fine. The Anglo-Saxons didn't know what to make of that, recording their views on the subject in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And the Norse actually had more advanced social attitudes than many other peoples of that time, women in particular, enjoying a freedom far greater than women in many other lands. Despite living in what was a very male-dominated society themselves, their rights to own property, to inherit, to control all aspects of the home, divorce their husbands more easily than was the case in other lands, and so on, as well as not being stigmatized during their menstrual periods or after childbirth as were women elsewhere. Nor were disputes always settled with an axe or a sword. Many disputes were settled very peacefully at the Thing, a gathering where people would discuss issues and problems and obtain judgments, which anyone could attend and be heard. Of course, disputes could involve violence, which is very understandable when so many people were armed, even if only with a knife. Most women would have carried a knife as well as the men. But like many other things, I suppose, violence gains more attention than non-violence as far as history goes. So, Eric bashing Olaf's head in with an axe because Olaf cheated him, well, that's much more interesting than if the law speaker of the Thing had simply ordered Olaf to pay compensation. Now, that would make a pretty dull saga. But brains spilled all over the place would make a gripping tale around the hearth on a winter night, and it looks good in movies and TV shows as well. So, that brings us towards the end of this attempt to set the record straight on the popular and often woefully wide of the mark image of the Vikings and aspects of Norse mythology and culture. Should the Vikings be seen as raiders? Well, yes, of course, because, well, they raided. But they didn't do it every day of every month of every year. They took time off to farm and grow crops, to make things, to have sex with women they hadn't abducted from somewhere but were actually married to. They raised families, built towns, told sagas to pass the time, carved runes on things, and buried their dead in often spectacular ways, such as entire ships containing the dead man or woman being covered with great mounds of earth and stone. And many of their expeditions overseas were to trade or to establish settlements, not just to raid and plunder. They did far more things than just leaping off dragon ships, waving axes and looking for men to kill, women to rape, and churches to burn. They spread new ideas to distant lands and brought back similar things to their own land, in an age when, well, most people knew very little about what lay beyond their own town or village, and nothing at all about other countries, even that they existed. The Norse were so much more than raiders and ships with dragon heads on their prow. They had a complex and well-devised social structure, a legal system, what we might today call family values. They regarded honour and bravery as important, were more accepting and tolerant of others than many other peoples of those days, or since indeed. Nor were they any more violent than others of their time. All things that deserve our respect. And many men would never have gone on a raid at all, never left their own village or town, plying their trade or profession, whatever it was, or perhaps gone on a raid or two, got as much profit as they wanted, and never gone raiding again. We must see them in the context of the age in which they lived. It was a very different world from that we know today, and allowances have to be made for that. We can't judge some things about them by our standards, though in truth, much of their society stands up very well to scrutiny by our present-day standards. There are sadly parts of the world in the 21st century that have lower standards of morals and ethics than did the Vikings over 1,000 years ago, who are not as tolerant and frequently just as brutal, sometimes even more so, and treat women especially in a degrading and humiliating manner which would have been unknown to the Norse. The popular image of big hairy men with axes leaping from dragon-headed ships with shields hung along the sides it's very exciting, it's very romantic, it's very thrilling, to be sure. And yes, it did occur. It occurred quite often, in fact. But not every Norseman was doing it. And those that did weren't doing it every day of every month all year round. They were not professional warriors. They were not soldiers whose sole task was to fight. No, they were generally speaking simply normal everyday men. Farmers, carpenters, merchants, craftsmen, jewelers, fishermen and the like. Men who were well able to be warriors if needs be. They were warriors, but part-time warriors who did whatever fighting was required, and well, then they just went back to ploughing a field or making a pair of shoes or whatever else it was they did. That is really how one should think of the Vikings, rather than the popular image of them as half-mad killing and raping machines in horned helmets. There were some full-time professional warriors, of course, the household troops and the jarls or kings, their personal bodyguards, but they weren't involved in raiding as such unless the nobles they served themselves went on a raid. So the Anglo-Saxons, the Picts, and the Irish Celts would seldom have encountered the professional household soldiers. So, with that, I shall say farewell and goodbye until next time.